welcome back. This is Brian Tier coming to you, and wanted to bring you our next message in the book of First Samuel. We're going to start in First Samuel chapter 17, where we left off with David. He had just came through a great victory, didn't he? And God gave him the victory over Goliath in chapter 17. And so David is going to rise in notoriety here pretty quickly into chapter 18 as we get into that chapter. But I have a few loose ends here I want to put together before we get fully into chapter 18. We will look at a few verses here, but chapter 18 is a dynamite chapter. I think you're really going to enjoy it. But I want to really concentrate on a few loose ends again that we've left here with David. Remember that God had already had Samuel anoint David to be king. So that was already done. Saul had not obeyed God like he ought to, and he was not repentant. He kind of was, he got to being more about himself really than what God wanted him to do and how he appeared to people versus how he appeared to God. And boy, we can fall into that too, can't we? It's easy for us to really to start thinking about how we appear to others more than we appear to God. And we need to forget about that and remember who we are working for, and that is the Lord. Everything that we do is for Him and for His glory and for His honor. That's going to come into play in some of the things we're going to talk about today as well. As David finishes up the fighting with Goliath and Israel goes out to battle against the Philistines, and they just basically run them out of town. Remember that the promise that Goliath had made to Israel is that if they could beat him, that the Philistines would then become Israel's, that's right, their servants. However, they ran off. Instead of resigning or surrendering, they did not do that. They went back on their word. And just remember that whenever you're fighting against this world or Satan or whatever that you want to say, that Satan does not play by the rules. He will lie to you. And that is the whole thing with sin. He makes things look good, but at the end of it, it's not going to be good. It's not going to result in good. Satan doesn't mind lying to you. He doesn't mind telling you half-truths or whole lies or whatever he has to do to get you into sin. He does that so that he breaks your testimony down. His whole thing is to damage people. And he doesn't like us because we are God's chosen, because God sent His Son to die for us. And so because of all of that, He is our enemy. He's God's enemy, and He's our enemy. And so we need to be aware of that, that the Philistines really are a very good resemblance of Satan and our battle with him. All right, so we get down to the end of the chapter. There's a little bit of something here that I want to make note of, just so for your own Bible study. It's in verse 55 through the remainder of the chapter. We really didn't get a chance to look at this. After David had, let's start in verse 54. In 54 it says, "And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent." So David kept the armor of Goliath, but he brought the head down to Jerusalem. Okay, and when Saul saw David go forth against the Philistines, he said to Abner, the captain of the host, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As my soul liveth, O king, I cannot tell." That's always troubled me a little bit because obviously he knew who David was. We saw in the previous chapter that David was brought in to play his harp for Saul whenever he wasn't feeling good, when that evil spirit came upon him. He also was Saul's armor bearer. But it doesn't seem that Saul really took notice of David during that whole time that he was helping him out with that. And so now remember that part of the reward for beating Goliath was that the person's family would live tax-free in Israel. And so Saul needed to know not just who David was, but who his father was as well, because in order for them to receive the reward And I think he was probably taking notice more of who David was as well. What family, what lineage did he come through and everything, because as we see in the next chapter, there's going to be some very big jealousy between David and Saul. Okay, and so this is going to play a big part of it because, and this is really what I wanted to talk about a little bit today, is how God had prepared David, or is preparing David, for the role that he's going to take in being king. God had already told Saul that I'm going to pass off your kingdom to your neighbor, which means that Jonathan would not inherit the kingdom. Someone else would. But God didn't say who that was. All right? But anybody that is coming up in popularity and fame is going to be somebody that Saul's going to keep an eye out for, because he's going to be thinking, is this the person? And he might be looking at everybody with that sort of eye. But certainly now that David has killed Goliath, this would be kind of a bells going off, or a buzzer going off, showing that hey, this might be the one that's going to take your kingdom away from you. And especially with what takes place into chapter 18, which we're not going to get into today. But we're going to get into some of it, but not all of it. All right, so just hold that thought. So this is the reason why that he was asking about whose David's family was, who his father was. He didn't say who is David. He said who is David's father, or who is this youth's father. Okay, and so it says in verse 36, and the king said, inquire thou whose son this strapling is. And David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine. Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with the head of the Philistine in his hand. All right. This is pretty kind of gruesome, isn't it, to think about David carrying Goliath's head in his hands? That would be really something. Okay, and so it says, and Saul said to him, whose son art thou, thou young man? And David answered, I am the son of thy servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. All right, and so this would tell Saul where David is from, who his relatives are. And again, I don't think that Saul was too concerned about that in the previous chapter. David was just basically a worker in the kingdom, and it's not somebody that Saul would say, hey, who's your dad, who's your family, and all this kind of stuff. But now that David has killed Goliath, he's more interested in who this young man is. Where did he come from? What's it about? And that is part of God bringing David into the place where he needed to be. You see, when God calls us into things, God is going to prepare us. He educates us. He gives us everything that we need in order to be the very best at that. God calls David maybe a few years before this. David now has done a lot of things to prepare himself for taking that kingly role on. He wasn't ready. He wasn't prepared to be king over here in whenever God called him, when Samuel went and anointed him. He wasn't prepared to take that role on. But understand, at this point, it's going to be another 15 years before he actually sits on the throne. God doesn't mind making us wait to educate us. Sometimes that's what we get into in our life. It's a little bit of a waiting game. Where do we need to be? What is God trying to teach me? And that's really where our mind needs to be. Right now, even in my life, it's a little bit of a fluctuation on what's next. What does God have next? And but I know this, in all the time that I've been ministering and pastoring and everything, that what God has for us next is just around the bend. Sometimes the intermediate parts are the times for us to train, the time for us to really get serious about our spiritual life. It gives us a time. Maybe you had that time last year during COVID. You know, a lot of people were home when they never had been before. They weren't able to go to their jobs. They weren't able to do a lot of things that they were normally able to. Well, let me tell you something. Whenever we have downtime, that downtime is time for us to be prepared, to be preparing, to educate ourselves, to get into God's Word, to get on our knees and pray. It's not a time for us to give up. It's not a time just for relaxation. You may do a little relaxation. That's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But we need to have our eyes and hearts in tune with what is God trying to do right now. When we get into those intermediate times, they're just they come around ever so often, and we don't know what's going to take place, what's going to happen next. This is a time for you to get in tune with God. All right, don't focus on what you can't control or anything like that. God will bring it around in His time. He is going to that time is the time that God will use to prepare you. And He did this all through the scriptures. You think about Joseph. We talked about Joseph a couple of years ago, or maybe last year in Vacation Bible School. But Joseph is a very, very good lesson on that, because he had to wait. He had 15 years or so that he was waiting there. 17 years that he waited from the time that God called him at 17 years old to the time that Pharaoh, I guess 13 years, that he went through prison. He went through being thrown in a pit. He went through being falsely accused and all these kind of things, being a slave. Those were all training times to prepare him for what God had for him a few years later. Moses was 40 years in the wilderness before the burning bush. I mean, I'm just here to tell you that sometimes God's preparing us. Now think about this, okay? I want you to think about what God has brought David through up to this point to prepare him to be a king and to be a great one. Number one, David had the heredity for it. You go all the way back to Genesis chapter 49, and God had promised through Jacob, given these blessings to his kids, the tribe of Judah, which is where David was from, that the scepter would not leave his hand. Okay, so God had already prepared that line was going to be a kingly line, a royal line. Okay, and so obviously the end goal, the end result of that is Jesus. That's the line that Jesus comes through and all that kind of stuff, and he's going to be the eternal king. But also in that line is David and his family. And David, Solomon, all those kings came through David's line. And so this was a fulfillment of prophecy. And little do you know that God has already a plan for your life. If you read about Jeremiah, you read about John the Baptist, God has plans for our lives. God has purposes for our lives. He knows what's going to take place. He has things already prepared in the beginning. It's just for us to make sure that we're on the path that God wants us to be on. He says, if you acknowledge me in all your ways, that He's going to direct our paths, right? I think that's what Proverbs chapter 3 that tells us that. And so we just need to make sure that we're acknowledging God in all of our ways. Let God worry about directing our path, where it goes, where it leads to. You're not going to be able to get off track. If you're trying to do what God wants you to do, He's going to make sure you're going to be right on track. Sometimes you're going to feel like you don't know where this train's going, but that doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. It's the ride that counts, And sometimes the ride's fun, sometimes it's long, sometimes it takes a little patience. So don't you worry about it. You just acknowledge God in all your ways. Allow Him to direct your steps. David's heredity shows this. Okay, Genesis chapter 49. Also, he was a shepherd. Where do we find David? Whenever God calls him, or where Samuel calls him, He's calling him out of the sheepfold. All right. David is learning a lot of great things. Shepherds have a lot of great qualities about them that would make them right in line for being a king. Moses, that's where God took Moses as well. He was tending sheep for 40 years, because then he was going to be leading the sheep of Israel, basically, out of the land of Egypt. There's a lot you can learn from tending sheep. You learn patience. When you're working a farm, when you're working with animals, you have to have patience with those animals. Let me tell you something. In being a king, David is going to have to know a lot about having patience. Okay, and so God is training him, giving him an education in having patience, waiting on the sheep to come. They don't just sprint or run; they follow after, and sometimes very slowly. You have to, guide them and all those kind of things. Also, caring, being a shepherd, they have to care for those animals. David would have to care for those animals. David, being a king, would need to care for the country of Israel. And so that's a very good quality that a king should have. Also loving. You know, one of the things that shepherds really stand out for is knowing their sheep, and the sheep knowing the shepherd and having. So it's a responsibility, and David would be picking this up and caring for those sheep. Not only would he learn patience and being caring and loving, dutiful or responsible, but he would also learn that he would have to be protective of those sheep as well. And this is, you know, you think about what David got while he was out there. He already told Saul that he had fought a lion and fought a bear. David had courage, didn't he? Would he need courage to be a king? Absolutely. He's going to be going out against the Philistines. He's going to be fighting and doing all of those things. And so in that, he needs to have courage. And that's one of the places I feel like that Saul kind of left off, is Saul lost his courage a lot of times. We need to have courage. And let me tell you something. All of these traits that I'm talking about, these are all traits that all of us need in the jobs and responsibilities that God has for us. And so they don't come overnight. And that's really what I want you to understand is that God's education process that he brings us through, we talk about growing in faith. It's about growing and caring and being concerned and having responsibility and patience and being protective and also having courage not to give up every time that something comes up. One of the things that I've really learned when we've been studying through the book of Matthew is we were talking about in chapter 12, I think it is. It talks, maybe 13, I can't remember, 12 or 13. It talks about the sowing the seeds, the parable of sowing the seeds and the different soil types that the seeds go into. Well, one of those, it goes into the soil and it comes up and it says the cares of the world chokes it out. And we don't need to be people that get choked out by the cares of the world. We need to have courage to stand and hold fast to those things, to have the patience that we need with God and with those that are around us. And as Christians, we're going to be leading people as David led them with Israel as well. So he had courage as well, and that God can take care of you in bad situations and tough situations. David learned that as well. He was also a musician. You know, he played the harp there for Saul. That's the way he got into being part of the palace at all. But he was a musician. You know, music is something that the Bible teaches us that we need. We need to sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. That's part of what gets us through. Being a songwriter, a hymn writer, a psalm writer, as David was, it would be a way to express himself. Because I'm going to tell you something that in being a leader, when times get tough, we need ways to express ourselves, and we can't just go out there and punch a door in or throw a fit or something like that. But you do have to have ways to express yourself and get things off of your chest. Writing songs and writing poems and writing even sermons and stuff like that is a good way to do it. You know, hopefully I don't take out my harshness on you guys if I have that sort of thing. But you know what I mean. Writing can help with that. David would need that. God would use that talent that he had. It would also teach him how to praise and how to pray and praise with those psalms. That's one of the things that David did, wasn't it? Is he praised God and he prayed to God in those psalms. If you read the book of Psalms, man, you see so many great prayers in there, and some of them were very, very tough. You could tell David was going through very tough times in his life. And so this is something that we learned, and God was teaching David during all of this. So you see, you might think that it's 15 wasted years. I can't believe that God would call him over here and then it would be 15 years later before he uses him. That's not the case at all. Whenever there's a lapse in time like that, remember, God a lot of times is educating us for the project that's coming up. We just need to be prepared for it. Okay? And so that's what we've got here. And also, he worked with Saul. We mentioned this a while back, but he got to work with Saul because of his talents in music, and because he was a wise person and he was a valiant person. He was able to come into the palace and play music for the king. Now, how awesome is that? God got him a front row seat to seeing what a king does day in and day out. You can't even pay for an education like that. And that's what I've learned a lot of times in being around people, other servants of the Lord. Sometimes you can't pay for an education like what you can get. We need to just pay attention is what we have to do. We have to pay attention to our pastors, to our teachers, to those that are around us, because God is allowing us their education, an education at their expense. And let me tell you something, those are sometimes the best ones. You need to listen. You need to pay attention and look around and see what you can learn. That's where true wisdom comes from, is when you don't have to learn everything yourself. You don't have to learn that if you touch a hot stove that it's going to burn your fingers. Somebody else has already done that, so you don't have to go do it yourself. Okay? You can see what happened to them. They probably even put it on YouTube. So go look on there. You'll probably find it. He was the armor bearer, so he learned how to fight with King Saul. That tells us that in previous chapters. So what a great blessing. So David's family, his heredity, the positions, the things that he was doing, the jobs that he was doing. You know, sometimes you think, the job that I have or whatever, I can't believe that I'm having to do this. I wish that I could do more ministry for the Lord. Well, God may use you in that job, or he may be using that job to educate you in something else that you're going to need to know down the road. So what I'm saying is, the big thing is to be patient. Be patient. Don't give up, and do the very best you can where you are. The very best. Learn everything that you can. It may be a very tough situation that you're in. It may be a very long and trying situation that you're in. Don't worry about it. God knows where you are. He can see you through, and he will see you through. He'll get you where you need to be. He's using this time as an education tool. You don't believe me? Study the scriptures. You're going to see it time and time again. All right, so you got that? So that's a little something I wanted to just get through there, so to make sure that we had that buttoned up, because that's some very, very valuable lessons for us.